Good evening and welcome to Maidstone Studios in Kent. Have you made up your mind yet? Wherever you live, whoever you vote for, one of these two men will be Prime Minister in a week's time. Tonight, for the next hour, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn will debate the future of our country. Now, neither Mr Johnson nor Mr Corbyn know the questions that they're going to face. They'll be posed by members of our audience here. They've been chosen by the pollsters, Savanta Comres, who invited people who support both of their parties and others who've yet to decide how to vote. People from all backgrounds, people from all walks of life. They're here to ask their questions, to listen to the answers, to listen to the debate, not to cheer on a team, let alone to boo their opponents. My job, then, is to try and make sure that their questions do get answered and that this debate is as free and as fair as possible. So, apologies, gentlemen, if I have to interrupt you occasionally, just to make sure this debate is fair and to make sure that we do make progress through all the questions we want to get through. Now, both leaders are going to make opening and closing statements. The order was decided by the toss of a coin. Jeremy Corbyn won the toss and elected to go first. Jeremy Corbyn, would you give us your opening statement, please?
Thank you. Labour is ambitious for our country and ambitious for you. I want to build a society where there is real opportunity for all, where everyone feels supported and secure, and where everybody has dignity in old age. There are now 4 million children living in poverty in our country. People can't get appointments to see their GP. Elderly people can't get the care they need. And millions of families are struggling to pay bills and make ends meet. They need an ambitious government on their side that will put money in their pockets, save our NHS, rebuild our public services, deliver free personal care for older people and free education for all. Yes, that does mean asking those with the broadest shoulders to pay a bit more in tax. A vote for Labour is a vote for hope, for real change, and for a country that works for the many, not just the few.
Mr Corbyn, thank you. Mr Johnson, would you like to make your opening statement, please?
On Thursday next week, this country reaches a turning point. We can get Brexit done, we can end the paralysis, we can transform our country with massive investments in health, 50,000 more nurses, more funding for every school, 20,000 more police. We can spread opportunity fairly with fantastic infrastructure, education and technology. And the only way to unleash the potential of this whole country is if we get a working majority Conservative government. Because the only possible alternative is another hung parliament, with Jeremy Corbyn and Nicola Sturgeon with an economic agenda that would take this country back decades, and 2 referendums, one on Scotland and a second toxic and divisive referendum on the EU. Let's give that nightmare a miss. Let's end the chaos, the deadlock. Let's get Brexit done with a one-nation Conservative government and take this country forwards.
Boris Johnson, thank you very much indeed. Well, let's get on with our questions now. Almost no rules tonight. Questions will be posed by the audience. Both men will get the chance to answer them and to debate their answers as well. Our first question tonight comes from John Purcell. John Purcell, please.
Is Sir John Major's recent intervention worrying to you, Mr Johnson? And is Mr Blair's recent intervention worrying to you, Mr Corbyn? Will these interventions make any difference to the result of the general election, or are they just a couple of old has-beens?
So the questioner, Mr Purcell, is referring to the fact that both John Major, your former leader, and Tony Blair, your former leader, have suggested that voters should consider voting for other parties and not giving you the majority you seek. Boris Johnson, your answer to Mr Purcell, please.
Well, Mr Purcell, John, I have the utmost respect, of course, for all former Conservative leaders and don't wish to deprecate anybody as a has-been, but I don't think he's right. And we have a fantastic plan to get Brexit done. It's a deal that's ready to go. It's oven-ready. We can get it done by Christmas, get it back into Parliament by Christmas if we have a majority Conservative government. And unlike Mr Major, I lead a party that is now totally united. All 630 plus Conservative candidates at this election actually back my deal. And
totally united because you got rid of anybody who didn't agree with you.
We have a very, very broad spectrum of views in our party, but they all back our deal. Now, the mystery is what is the position of the leader of the opposition on this subject, because I've yet to hear what the deal is that he wants to achieve and whether he backs it himself.
Jeremy Corbyn, the question was, should you be worried about Tony Blair saying to people, don't necessarily vote Labour?
The issue coming up on Thursday is the future of this country. Are we going to continue with this level of inequality, of poverty amongst our children, of underfunding of our schools and a threat to our National Health Service, and a no-deal Brexit, which the Prime Minister is threatening us with, or a trade deal with Donald Trump and the USA, which will damage our public services? A vote for Labour is a vote to end austerity. A vote for Labour is to invest in the future of this country. And so Tony Blair and John Major are welcome to make the comments that they do. I urge them to think for a moment at the reality of what 9 years of austerity has done to the people of this country.
What's happened to your party, Mr Corbyn, that the most successful Labour Prime Minister in history cannot back you to move into number 10?
I am fighting this election to win it on our manifesto, which I believe will bring real hope to those people that have been denied it during these years of austerity.
Isn't the truth that many voters think there's an impossible choice? They don't want either of you in number 10 Downing Street.
Well, I hope very much that people will vote for a one-nation Conservative government and get Brexit done. And I think, actually, if you look at our agenda, it's positive, it's progressive, it will unite the country, involve massive investment in public services and take us forward.
Our government will empower people. Our government will not leave anybody behind. That is the whole principle, the golden thread that runs through our manifesto.
Well, let's turn to Brexit. It's already been raised many times already. And on this question, we're going to take two questions, one from a Leave voter, one from a Remain voter. So, first of all, Yvonne Emerton, who voted Leave, please.
Brexit has taken up so much time already. People are really fed up. Can you guarantee that it will happen next year?
Can you guarantee it'll happen next year? And then Tom Clark, who voted Remain.
How would we be better off from the Brexit deal or a future Labour deal compared to what we already have as a member of the EU?
Thank you very much. Let's turn first to Yvonne Emerton's question. Can you guarantee that Brexit will happen next year? Jeremy Corbyn.
What I can guarantee is that we'll bring an end to this debate and we will have a final say for the people of this country. We cannot go on forever saying we represent the 48 or the 52. I want to lead a government that represents the whole country and the whole community. So we will, within 3 months, negotiate a Leave agreement with the European Union that will protect trade and jobs and the peace process in Northern Ireland, and put that alongside Remain in a referendum within 6 months, and that will be the end of the matter. My role as the leader of my party, as the Prime Minister, would be to ensure that decision is carried out, whatever it is. But nobody voted to lose their job or to lose trade with Europe. People voted for many, many reasons, but I think we've got to come together and bring this issue to an end, not go down the road of sweetheart deals with the USA.
Boris Johnson.
Well, I share the frustration of both our questions about the length of time it's taken to get Brexit done. And what we can do with the deal that we have is get it done by January the 31st and come out. And then to get to the question about the advantages, we can do such things as improve our standards for animal welfare, ban the live export of animals. We can cut VAT on tampons. We can do things to create free ports around the country. There are all sorts of ways in which we can regulate differently and better. We can also, of course, control our immigration system for the first time in a long time. Now, what I haven't heard from the leader of the Labour Party is this deal that he thinks he can get in 3 months' time. Who is going to negotiate it? Because as far as I can see, everybody on the Labour front bench is campaigning to Remain, apart from Mr Corbyn, who is neutral on the matter. Who is going to secure this deal? How can you get a deal, a new deal from Brussels for Brexit, if you don't actually believe in it? That's the mystery that I failed to understand.
Jeremy Corbyn, how do you get a deal, he asks, if you don't really believe in it? And John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and Keir Starmer, all the rest, they say they're Remainers.
We get a deal in order to ensure that whatever the outcome of final vote, the trade relationship continues with Europe. If you go down the road, it'll take 7 years to negotiate a trade deal with the USA, you're going to have queues all up the M20 in Kent. You're going to have a problem of supply chain to all of our manufacturing industries. You're going to have job losses on a huge scale.
Nonsense, he says. Why are you saying nonsense?
Unless you have a serious deal with the EU to maintain that trade relationship.
We have a deal. It's a wonderful deal. We're coming out on January the 31st if we can get a working majority. And I'm afraid, listening to Mr Corbyn, it's absolutely clear that what would happen next year is there'd be a period of negotiation about this mystery deal led by somebody in the Labour Party that we can't yet identify, since Mr Corbyn doesn't believe in the deal himself. It would then be put to another referendum to the people of this country. Parliament, our country, would spend a whole year more, probably more, locked in debate about Brexit, when what people want to do is move on and focus on the issues facing the people.
Jeremy Corbyn.
And that's what we can do immediately.
And Mr Johnson will spend at least 7 years negotiating with the USA on access to our public services, on the price of medicines in Britain, on the access to our National Health Service. And he knows he can't get a deal quickly with the USA because of the way in which the US political system works. And so what he will do is walk out of a relationship with the EU into a relationship with nobody. And that is where the chaos will come.
What's your answer to that, Boris Johnson?
I have to say, I'm afraid that shows a slight ignorance of the reality, which is that as we leave the EU, we are coming out with our deal, with a state of perfect equivalence, zero tariff, zero quota. We'll be able to begin not only putting in our Australian-style points-based system for immigration, taking back control of our laws, taking back control of our money. We'll also be able to...
He asked you about trade, though, Mr Johnson.
Trade talks, not just with countries around the world, but we will do a fantastic deal with the EU and with the US.
Can we be clear, Mr Johnson? You again and again say the phrase, get Brexit done.
That's right.
But you haven't done a trade deal with the EU. You don't know you can do a trade deal with the EU. You don't know there won't be no deal on trade with the EU, do you? On
the contrary, we have a fantastic deal. It is there, ready to go. And
not a trade, forgive me. You don't have a trade.
What our deal allows is for British businesses of all kinds to have perfect confidence in the way we leave the EU, because we are in a state of equivalence with zero tariff, zero quota, exact regulatory framework, and we have ample time to get on and build a new free trade partnership, not just with the EU, but with countries around the world. And the great beauty of this deal is that it gets Brexit done, gets it out of Parliament, stops the wrangling, stops the chaos, and moves us forward.
Thank you very much. Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn.
Boris Johnson is going to spend years negotiating with the USA. He's going to spend years ruining the fact he didn't reach a proper agreement with the EU before leaving. And as the documents we've shown today indicate, he hasn't been exactly straightforward on the issues surrounding trade with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And so I do think we need a bit of openness from the government. We forced them to release the documents, or we released them for them, actually, a week ago, which showed the access that the US were demanding to our public services. And today, the news came out of what's happening with Northern Ireland. And
briefly, Mr Corbyn, for people who didn't hear the news, what are you claiming the documents show? And then we'll put it to Mr Johnson.
They show quite clearly that there are going to be charges, there are going to be customs checks, there are going to be restrictions on trade between Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you very much. Boris Johnson.
Well, actually, that is not true. The whole of the UK comes out... England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland together. We do free trade deals together. Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the UK, and we are united. And I have to say, I think it's a great opportunity for our country. And it says unfettered access, I think is what it says.
It says unfettered access, and all through it questions the fettering that will happen.
That is what we will have.
One at a time, please.
And that is, and what the document also says is that Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the UK. And, you know,
isn't the problem, Mr Johnson, that the DUP, the Unionists, who were your partners, they agree with him and not you?
Well, they don't, actually, because our deal is a great deal. Well, let me just make one point. I do find it slightly curious, to say the least, Nick, to be lectured about the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland by a man who all his life, political life, has campaigned to break up that union and actually supported for 4 decades the IRA in their campaign violently to destroy it. I must say I find it a curiosity.
Jeremy Corbyn, what's your
How
answer to
about
that?
the Prime Minister showing a degree of honesty about the arrangements he's actually made with Northern Ireland? He spoke at a DUP conference and said there would be no restrictions whatsoever. We now know there are restrictions. He should and could have said that at the time. And so it is a question of openness on all of this.
Being open, he says, you've supported people who are opposed to the union your whole life. You don't even believe
what
in
I've
the
done
United Kingdom.
is always wanted to see a peace process in Northern Ireland, and that is exactly what we've got. And thank you to the Labour government that negotiated it after 1997.
Now, gentlemen, briefly. Thank you. There was a second question. I want to give you the chance. If you remember, let me just remind you, Tom Clark asked you, Mr Johnson, how will we be better off from the Brexit deal or a future Labour deal compared to being in the EU? Please.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. And there will be all sorts of ways. I've mentioned the ways we can cut VAT on sanitary products or regulate differently for bioscience or have free ports in areas that need investment. You can trigger growth and investments in some of the left-behind coastal communities by having free ports, as 130 countries do around the world. We can't, because of EU rules. Another major advantage is, of course, that we take back control of a lot of money that we'd otherwise send to the EU. But I might mention also our ability to control our immigration, which is not unimportant. I'm a believer in immigration for people of talent who want to come here, fantastic, but we've got to control it democratically.
Jeremy Corbyn, your answer to the question,
to do.
Forgive me, how will we be better off from Brexit, you're asked, if you have your deal, or indeed, and you go to a referendum and it passes and we do leave?
Because we will make sure that our jobs and our manufacturing industries are able to continue trading. Over half of our trade is with Europe at the present time. Walk away from that. Put up a barrier on that, then you've got real problems for manufacturing industry jobs all across the country. Many jobs have already been lost because of the uncertainty surrounding all this. We have to deal with this within 6 months. The Prime Minister's suggestions of a trade deal with the USA, which will take, at least in their estimation, 7 years to negotiate, means 7 years of complete uncertainty and continued job losses in manufacturing industry.
Jeremy Corbyn, you've been asked by Boris Johnson, I want to give you the chance to answer it, why you won't say where you stand on Brexit. Is it that you don't know what you think about Brexit, or that you do know but you won't tell people?
It's because I think the country has to come together and cannot keep on negotiating and arguing with itself about 48 versus 52. It has to be an agreement we can reach with the EU that is credible and would maintain that trade relationship but would be outside of EU membership or full membership of the EU. That is a way of bringing people together, and a government that implements that decision, whatever it is.
Very brief response.
You cannot end the uncertainty. You cannot end the uncertainty on Brexit if you don't know what the deal is that you want to do. I negotiated our deal. You cannot negotiate a deal if you're neutral on it. It's absolutely inconceivable. And I think it is, I'm afraid to say, a failure of leadership not to have a position on the greatest issue facing this country at the moment.
Thank you very much.
You cannot get a good deal for this country if you don't believe it. And I've yet to understand how Mr Corbyn proposes to negotiate a deal for Brexit.
Well, you put that to him and he's had the chance to respond. So let's move on to the National Health Service, another crucial issue. We've got a question from Faith Zalumis. Faith Zalumis, please.
Thank you. I am returning to my nursing studies next April. It costs a lot to train as a nurse, but the starting salaries are low. How would you deal with the shortage of nurses and ensure the NHS can retain them?
So Faith, who is a student nurse, says, how would you deal with the shortage of nurses and ensure that the NHS can retain them? Boris Johnson.
Well, Faith, thank you very much for what you're doing, and I believe passionately we need more nurses in the NHS. I've been in power in office for about 130 days, and everything I've seen convinces me this is now the time to invest massively in our NHS. So what we're doing is putting in the biggest cash boost, £34 billion more, 50,000 more nurses, and I should unpack that figure. People complain about it, but it means retaining the 19,000 who might otherwise drop out of the service, and then recruiting another 31,000 new nurses. Plus, we're bringing back the £5,000 bursary. One thing that we're doing that I think is sensible, and that our Australian-style points-based system allows us to do, is to encourage nurses from overseas to come to fill some of the gaps by shortening the time for their visa application. Now, what I think is totally incomprehensible is to have a system where you try to get more nurses and more staff into the NHS and simultaneously ask the whole of the public sector to work a 4-day week.
Thank you very much.
Bad for patients and bad for the NHS.
Jeremy Corbyn, thank you. Just to remind you of the question, Faith Zalumis says, how would you deal with the shortage of nurses and ensure the NHS can retain them?
Well, there are 43,000 nurse vacancies at the present time. It was a Conservative government that cut the nurse bursary. It was a Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition that increased student fees to £9,000 a year, and that is a major contributory factor to the stress levels that exist within our NHS. It is at breaking point, it is at crisis point. Go to any A&E department and you'll see that straight away. So what we'd do is end university fees, which will mean more people go into studying. What we will do is return the nurse bursary, probably on a more generous scale than it was in the past, and we will recruit as rapidly as we possibly can. But crucially, we will fund the NHS properly. £40 billion in total will go into the NHS in order to fund it properly, and that has to be done. The Prime Minister, the day after he was appointed, announced there was going to be 40 new hospitals.
Yes.
A week later, that became 20. A bit later on, it became 6 new hospitals. He seems to have a problem with the figures about hospital building in Britain.
Perhaps I could elucidate.
Please.
Well, perhaps I could elucidate Mr. Corbyn, who has a problem with coming up with his Brexit policy. But the reality is that we have a very clear agenda, which is to upgrade 20 hospitals, to build 40 new ones. It's perfectly true that the cash allocation for the whole hospital build is for 6 initially, but we're putting in the seed funding now so that they can do the architect's drawings, do the plans, do all the business case, so that in 10 years' time, as a result of the decisions taken just in the last 130 days by this government, there will be 40 new hospitals in this country.
Well, what's wrong with that is 12 hours or 15 hours after being appointed Prime Minister, he came to Parliament and grandly announced there was 40 new hospitals. It turned out there weren't. That's when he was asked where they were going to be. That was then reduced to 20, and then it became seed funding for 6. It's not credible to make those kind of statements and not be able to back it up with any serious plan.
Is it credible, Mr Corbyn, Mr Johnson asked you a second ago, is it credible to say you'll deal with nursing shortages while agreeing to a 4-day week, which will surely make the shortages worse?
What we have said is that we want to see the working week come down. The average working week across the country is 38 hours, and we achieve bringing it down by improved productivity in industries and services. There is no plan to bring in a 4-day week in the NHS, but there is a plan to properly invest in our NHS, because I am fed up. We're seeing people queuing and waiting and being in desperate straits trying to get an appointment to see a GP or to go into hospital.
Boris Johnson.
And John McDonnell said very clearly that there was a plan for a 4-day working week, and it's not clear why Mr Corbyn has resolved from that tonight. But what I will say is that we will invest massively in the NHS. This is a new government. It's a very ambitious government. I want to see more funding going into our public services. We're levelling up funding of education in schools around the country, 20,000 more police. But we can only do that by having a strong economy. And the only way, I mean, you're not going to like this, Nick, but the only way we can have a strong economy is if we move this country forward and get Brexit done. And I'll just remind you of one report that came out the other day. There is £150 billion worth of investment waiting to come into this country if we can get my deal across the line. Now, what would this country prefer to have?
Thank you, Mr Johnson.
£150 billion worth of investment.
Forgive me interrupting.
Corbyn's 2 referendums.
Forgive me interrupting. I'm keeping a very close eye on the time, and you've had rather a lot, Mr Johnson. Corbyn needs to catch up.
That the Conservatives and Liberal Democrats passed the Health and Social Care Act after 2010, and that has led to £10 billion of private sector involvement in the NHS, with often different wage structures and a difficulty in management. Labour will end privatisation with the NHS and return it to what it was always intended to be, a fully funded, fully functioning public health service in this country.
You will end privatisation, you say? Are you still claiming that the NHS is up for sale? Because your document doesn't seem to show any such thing.
Well, read the documents that were discussed in secret, and the government refused to release them, between themselves and the US administration, about access to public services and the extension of the life of patents on medicines, which would increase medicine costs in this country. President Trump has said many times people pay too little for US medicines around the world. That's the kind of agenda the Prime Minister wants to get involved with. That's the kind of deal they're trying to make with the USA.
Boris Johnson, he says you want to sell the NHS.
I have to say, this is pure Bermuda Triangle stuff. We've heard it time and time again from the Labour Party during this election campaign. We'll be hearing about Little Green Men next. I believe very passionately in I use the NHS, I love it. It's one of the most incredible things about this country. It is admired around the world. The central idea that if any of us get sick, all of us take care of them. It's a fantastic thing. Now, we believe in an NHS free at the point of use, and under no circumstances will we sell it off to anybody in any kind of a trade deal. I would just remind... You
don't dispute, though, do you, Mr Johnson? You don't dispute what he's quoted, which is that American trade negotiators say they want more access to the NHS.
And I've made it absolutely clear to everybody that under no circumstances will that happen. And the biggest privatisation of the NHS, of course, took place under the last Labour government, which put in the ruinous PFI system. And I've gone round many hospitals talking to fantastic staff and management there who are bearing the burden of that debt.
Jeremy Corbyn.
We will now have to deal with it.
I just remind you, your party opposed the formation of the NHS in the first place.
Well, you're now going back to 1940. And I know that you have a long memory from politics.
It is factually so. It is factually so, but the more important thing is that your party has presided over cuts in our NHS, increased waiting times and waiting lists, record number of people delayed in getting appointments, and a social care system that is in crisis.
And there are 17,000 more nurses now than there were under the Labour Party, and that's because we've had a strong economy that's enabled us to make investments, and we are now going to step those investments up, because we believe passionately in the NHS, and the way to take this country forward, the way to get it moving, is to get rid of the blockade in Parliament, get Brexit done and move on.
There are 43,000...
one nation majority Conservative government.
Let me just ask you, Mr
Corbyn. There are 43,000 nurse vacancies, that's the fact.
Understood. Now, you sent an email on behalf of the Labour Party saying, imagine opening a 5-figure bill for your cancer treatment. Do you accept that that is totally misleading? There is no possibility of anybody having NHS cancer treatment and having to pay a 5-figure
If you end up with a privatised service, that's what you get. If you end up with that US trade deal, that is what you get. Now, the Prime Minister says he's not going to do that sort of a trade deal. If that's the case, why did the talks go on for 2 years? It doesn't take 2 years to say no to privatisation of the NHS.
OK, thank you, gentlemen. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. We've got lots and lots of questions to get through. I want to give you the chance to move on. Now, because we've had lots of questions, one or two we're going to make rather quicker than the rest. I'll come to one of those in just a second. You can join in this debate, of course. Hashtag BBC Debate on social media. And before we return to one of our longer questions, we've got an interesting question here from Phil Wason, who has written in, can't be here tonight, which has the better track record of raising the standards, the living standards of the poor, socialism or capitalism? Jeremy Corbyn.
Socialism carried out in a democratic way in this country, in Scandinavia and other places, has raised the living standards of the very poorest. And it was the post-war Labour government that did massively to improve the living standards of the poorest working class communities in this country. And our Labour government will do the same again.
And I would say that it is one nation conservatism, which understands the vital importance of a dynamic market economy as the only way in which you can pay for fantastic public services and for giving and for looking after the poorest and neediest in our society. That is the balance and symmetry at the heart of what I'm trying to achieve with this government. And I think that to attack capitalism, as Mr Corbyn and Mr McDonnell do, is absolutely senseless. And by the way, to continue to attack all free trade is, I also think, ignorant of the facts.
Just to be clear, Mr Johnson, do you think he wants to destroy capitalism? Do you? Is that your view?
John MacDonald, who is the Shadow Chancellor, and some would say the intellectual driving force behind this type of palio socialism, is committed, he says, to fomenting the overthrow of capitalism. Okay. I think that is a mistake. I don't think that's the right way forward for our country. I believe in supporting businesses. I believe in cutting business rates.
My kind of socialism is one where you don't leave people behind. You don't ignore the fact that 4 million of our children are living in poverty. You don't ignore the fact that there are thousands of people sleeping on the streets of this country. The fifth richest country in the world. The inequality has got worse. 150 billionaires in Britain, more people poor than ever.
Jeremy
That
Corbyn,
cannot
thank
be
you.
right.
We're going to turn on to a broader question. We're moving on to a broader question about the economy, so both of the leaders will have the chance to talk at greater length. Andrew Brooke has our next question. Andrew Brooke, please.
Thank you. Both of you say that if you're asked to form a government next week, you will spend, 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 making your plans, your expenditure plans, that is, seem like a fantasy. How are we really going to pay for everything that you are promising?
Andrew Brooke, thank you very much indeed. Spend, spend, spend. He says you're both going to do, gentlemen. He wants to know how both of you are going to pay, or rather how we're going to pay for your plans.
Well,
Boris Johnson.
Andrew, thank you very much. And we will certainly be making some big investments in, as I say, in the NHS, in putting more police on the streets, in lifting up our education funding for every school in the country. And we're going to continue with that. But what we won't do is borrow hugely to fund day-to-day investment. And that is the mistake that the Labour Party would make. They would rack up our debts. They would put up spending to 1.2 trillion. To answer your question, what that would mean is a tax burden of £2,400 per taxpayer. And, you know, you hear from Labour sometimes that the burden is, I think Mr Corbyn said it just now, the burden is going to fall only on the 150 billionaires or the top 5%. Actually, people on as little as £20,000 a year under their plans will be paying £1,000 a year more in tax.
Jeremy Corbyn, he says the people who are not rich will pay for your plans.
We're very clear about that, and we are the only party that's produced a fully costed manifesto with a grey book that adds up to every piece of expenditure we want.